My sister locked me in my room as my blood sugar plummeted to 30 and my dad was downstairs, believing her lies about me sabotaging the dinner party. The key turned in the lock from the outside and I heard Olivia Bennett's heels clicking down the hallway while my hands shook too much to hold my phone. My blood sugar monitor read 52 and decreasing. That horrific freefall meant I had around 18 minutes before losing consciousness totally. I was grabbing for my emergency glucose tablets when I heard her go up the stairs. And now the bottle lay on the floor somewhere in the darkness, dispersed on the carpet after I knocked it over while attempting to get to the door. Olivia Bennett's lovely and sorry voice echoed through the wood, informing my father downstairs that I was in one of my adolescent mood swings and needed time alone to calm down before his business partners arrived for dinner. She said I'd been harsh about her cuisine and dismissive of the evening's significance, and that I'd locked myself in on purpose to destroy the dinner party she'd spent weeks arranging. My father's reaction was muted but acceptable, believing her version of events as he usually did, and I knew with crystalline dread that she had just sentenced me to death alone in my bedroom while they entertained clients downstairs. The glucose pills were somewhere in the darkness. My backup insulin was in the kitchen refrigerator, and my phone's CGM was so scary that I couldn't keep it stable enough to call 911. I was 17 years old with type 1 diabetes, and my father's girlfriend of 7 months had just locked me in my room to create the ideal setting for her networking dinner. I had been managing my type 1 diabetes for 7 years when Olivia Bennett joined our life, and I was comfortable with my routine of testing blood sugar, calculating carbohydrates, and delivering insulin via my pump. My mother died when I was 7, and for the following 3 years, it was just my father and me figuring out life together, including my diabetes diagnosis at age 10, which converted our world into a delicate balance of numbers and time. Dad worked hard hours as a commercial real estate developer, but he always made time for my endocrinologist visits and made sure I had enough supplies. When he began dating again after Mom had been gone for 4 years, I was supportive, wanting him to be happy, even if the thought of someone replacing Mom made my chest tighten. Olivia Bennett was the 5th lady he dated seriously. Olivia, unlike the others who had been polite but plainly concerned about taking on a youngster with a chronic disease, appeared almost too flawless. She was 36 years old, Dad was 47, and she was a pharmaceutical sales representative with a stylish style and the type of confidence that made people listen when she spoke. She'd researched type 1 diabetes before meeting me, asked thoughtful questions about my management routine, and even recommended a new insulin pump model that her firm didn't sell but had greater features than mine. Dad had fallen hard and fast, and I tried to be pleased for him, disregarding the minor red flags that Olivia's perfection was a show with an agenda I couldn't see. Olivia began remarking on my blood sugar levels approximately 4 months into their relationship, which was the first hint of a problem. She'd requested to check my readings every evening, portraying it as a kind concern, but her tone was judgmental when my numbers weren't perfect. She'd question whether I'd accurately counted my carbohydrates or whether I was smuggling stuff that I shouldn't have. Never mind that type 1 diabetes does not operate that way, and Dr. Harris said my control was great. When I explained that blood sugar changes for a variety of reasons other than nutrition, Olivia grinned and claimed she worked in pharmaceuticals and knew more about medical disorders than most people. Dad had nodded along, apparently impressed by her expertise, and I'd let it go, even though her grasp was superficial and incorrect in critical areas. The second red flag appeared when she moved into our home after just 6 months of dating, bringing her fancy furnishings and a desire to rearrange our whole housekeeping routine. Suddenly, family dinners had to start at 6:30 p.m., regardless of my insulin scheduling, and my diabetic supplies had to be housed in designated spaces that matched her aesthetic, rather than where they were most convenient for me. She had rearranged the kitchen and relocated my emergency glucose stash from the counter to a high cupboard since the packing seemed crowded. And once I refilled the counter, she moved them again. Dad had intervened, proposing that I keep supplies in my room if Olivia wanted a clean kitchen, not realizing that diabetic crises do not wait for you to rush upstairs. I had complied to maintain the peace, putting a little fridge in my room for insulin and storing glucose pills around, knowing that fighting back would result in confrontation that Dad couldn't manage. The third red sign appeared last month, when Olivia began preparing tonight's dinner party, a high-stakes evening with Dad's most important possible clients, the Maxwells, who owned a development business that may land Dad's biggest contract. Olivia had taken over the entire planning process, hiring caterers and event personnel, and transformed our home into something out of a magazine cover. She'd been too concerned with details, shouting at both Dad and me when things weren't perfect, worrying about lighting, music, and flower placement. When I asked about the meal and if I could check carb counts to plan my insulin, Olivia waved me off, saying she'd handle it, that I shouldn't worry about food and instead enjoy the evening. The rejection made my stomach plummet since controlling diabetes required me to always be aware of what and when I was eating. But she had made it appear as if I was being difficult by asking. She informed me yesterday that I would be having supper in my room tonight rather than attending the party because teens would make the event feel too informal. Dad had objected weakly, stating I was a member of the family and should be involved. However, Olivia claimed that this was business, not family time, and that my presence would detract from professional networking. She had promised to bring me a plate and said I could come down for dessert, making it appear fair, despite the fact that we both knew she was excluding me to maintain her flawless image. I agreed since arguing with Olivia usually made Dad upset and nervous, and I discovered that preserving the peace was simpler than demanding my wants. This afternoon, everything shattered into turmoil. Olivia had been in the kitchen, overseeing the catering workers, when I arrived about 4 to check my blood sugar and have a snack before dinner. My CGM had been drifting downward all afternoon, lingering in the low 80s, and I needed something to pull it back up before it went into dangerous area. I just grabbed a juice box from the fridge, the rapid sugar I relied on in these situations, when Olivia Bennett appeared alongside me, furious. She pulled the juice box from my grasp and told me I wasn't allowed to eat or drink anything before the dinner party because the caterers wanted the kitchen cleared and she didn't want me interrupting their work. I'd attempted to explain that my blood sugar was plummeting and that I needed the juice now, not later. But she cut me off, saying I was overdramatic. She accused me of sabotaging her evening by creating medical crises that required attention, of being envious that Dad had met someone new, and of manipulating circumstances with my diabetes. The charges were so surprising, so out of context, that I stood transfixed as she threw the juice box in the garbage and instructed me to go to my room and stay there until Mother returned to collect me for supper. When I objected, she came in close and told me in hushed tones that if I caused any difficulties tonight, if I made a scene or attempted to divert Dad's focus away from his clients, she'd make sure he knew how manipulative I had been about my medical condition. She had reminded me that Dad's business was faltering, that this deal may rescue our family's finances, and that my selfishness had the potential to destroy all he had fought so hard for. I had gone upstairs, shivering with rage and dread. My blood sugar is currently at 70 and decreasing. I texted Dad that I needed help, but his phone was set to quiet due to client dinner preparations. I checked my supplies and remembered my backup emergency glucose was in the kitchen, where Olivia had barred me, and my insulin pump indicated that I had plenty in the reservoir, but I'd need to change it tomorrow. The logical thing would have been to go downstairs and get some juice while Olivia was busy, but her threats and my father's reliance on tonight's success had immobilized me. Instead, I attempted to manage with the glucose pills I had in my room, taking 4 and waiting to see whether my blood sugar level stabilized. For 30 minutes, I observed my CGM, which hovered in the mid-70s before dropping again. At 60, I knew I needed more glucose, so I grabbed the container to take more pills, and then I heard Olivia come up the stairs. I'd gone to the door to beg her to bring juice, convinced that she wouldn't allow me fall into diabetic shock. But as I opened the door, she was already there, hand poised to knock. Her expression was cold and determined as she pulled me back into the room and told me I needed to stay until the clients departed because she couldn't trust me not to spoil her evening. She'd noticed my glucose tablet bottle and kicked it away when it fell, before walking out and locking the door from the outside with the key we'd never used, the old-fashioned mechanism Dad thought was wonderful when we purchased the property. Now I was on my hands and knees groping over the carpet for scattered glucose pills, my eyesight beginning to fade around the edges. My CGM was screaming alarms, displaying 45 and continuously lowering, indicating a fast plummet that would leave me unconscious shortly. I discovered 3 pills and devoured them furiously. The chalky taste was once calming, but now it served as a reminder of how inadequate they were for this catastrophe. When I eventually managed to unlock my phone, my hands were so shaky that I could scarcely hold it. However, my fingers would not comply with the touchscreen to dial 911. I dialed Dad's number, but it went straight to voicemail. His phone remained silent during the dinner gathering. I tried texting my closest friend Sophia, but the message came out as gibberish. Autocorrect couldn't make sense of my failing motor control. Below me, I could hear the dinner party begin, folks greeting each other with professional affection. Olivia Bennett's giggle was bright and sweet as she welcomed the Maxwells to our house. The noises were bizarre in comparison to my reality, as the regular social gathering took place while I was isolated in my room dying of hypoglycemia. I considered yelling for assistance, but Olivia had switched up classical piano music downstairs, which would drown out any sounds coming from upstairs. She'd meticulously organized this, assuring that even if I tried to draw attention, the dinner party would continue uninterrupted. I made it to my bed before my legs gave out entirely, dropping onto the mattress as my blood sugar continued to plummet. At 37, I realized I was in grave danger. The level at which convulsions and unconsciousness occur, and irreversible brain injury is a genuine possibility. My thoughts were getting disorganized and sluggish. Severe hypoglycemia causes cognitive impairment, which makes problem-solving difficult. I tried the door again, crawling because standing was no longer an option, and tugged on the handle with weak hands. The lock remained solid, and Olivia had presumably taken the key with her since I couldn't see it through the old-fashioned keyhole. My window was on the second level, overlooking the backyard, too high to safely jump and facing away from the street, where someone may notice me. I pondered smashing the window and yelling, but the dinner party was in the formal dining room on the other side of the house. The catering workers were in the kitchen, and the music would drown out any sounds. Plus, shattering a window during Dad's most important business dinner would damage the contract he sorely needed, proving Olivia's claim that I was attempting to sabotage the occasion. The notion threw me between survival instinct and the psychological trickery she'd spent months perfecting, making me wonder if dying peacefully was preferable than spoiling her ideal night. My phone vibrated with a text from Sophia asking if I wanted to video chat. And I attempted to react, but my fingers stopped working. The CGM was reading 34, which was severely low, and I could feel awareness slipping away in waves. I thought about my mother, how she would never have allowed this to happen, how she would have prioritized my health before any business dinner or social commitment. I thought about Dad downstairs, fully oblivious that his daughter was dying 20 feet above him because he had trusted his girlfriend above his own instincts. For a little period, the rage that surged through me helped to clear the air. And I used that awareness to attempt again to dial 911. My hand was trembling so violently that I couldn't see the screen, but I was able to press the emergency call button before my vision tunneled to a pinpoint and then went dark. I'm not sure if the call was connected. I am not sure whether I stated anything understandable. I only knew that I felt myself slipping into darkness as dinner party talk and laughter boomed across my bedroom floor. I awoke to nearby sounds fighting and bright lights shining through my closed eyes. Someone said my name and asked me to open my eyes. When I cracked them open, I noticed a paramedic's face hovering above me. She was youthful, perhaps in her late 20s, with gentle eyes and hair tied up in a bun. And she was telling me that I was okay. That they had given me glucagon, and that my blood sugar was rising again. My arm stung where an IV was inserted, and I could taste the sickly sweet residue of the glucagon shot that had saved my life. The paramedic identified herself as Emma Lawson, stated that she was with the LA County Fire Department, and asked if I could explain her what had happened. My lips was dry, and my thoughts were muddled, but I was able to mutter that I had been confined in my room. Emma's look suddenly shifted from professional worry to focused concentration, and she requested me to repeat it. Behind her, I could see another paramedic speaking with someone in the doorway. And despite my still foggy eyesight, I recognized my father's silhouette, his posture emanating worry and perplexity. Emma leaned in and inquired directly who had locked me in the room and when. I informed her it was Olivia approximately 2 hours ago, just before the dinner party. The other paramedic looked at Emma, then called for the police officers who had presumably arrived with the ambulance. The following 30 minutes were a flurry of medical evaluations and probing questioning. Emma stayed with me while her partner, an older guy called Rick Turner, who had been a paramedic for 18 years, assessed my vital signs and tested my blood sugar again. They indicated that 911 got a call from my phone about 7:20, that they heard hard breathing followed by stillness, and that when the operator did not obtain a response, they dispatched emergency personnel to my location. The fire brigade arrived first and discovered the front door locked with the dinner party and ongoing. They yelled loudly until someone replied, then forced their way upstairs when they heard my CGM alarm go off through my bedroom door. They discovered the door locked from the outside, with the old skeleton key still in the lock, and me asleep on the floor, my blood sugar at 30 and dangerously low for an extended period of time. Rick stated that they had supplied glucagon promptly and phoned for police assistance because the closed door issue prompted concerns about suspected negligence or abuse. Now there were 2 LAPD detectives in my room. Detective Mia Sullivan, who had been on the police for 12 years, and a uniformed officer named Daniel Grant, who was photographing the door, the lock, and the strewn glucose pills on my carpet. Detective Sullivan crouched by my bed, where the paramedics had transported me, and inquired whether I felt well enough to answer questions. When I nodded, she took out a recording device and asked me to recount everything that had transpired today from the start. I told her everything, my voice growing stronger as my blood sugar level stabilized, the words pouring out in a surge of rage, terror, and relief. I detailed Olivia relocating my glucose supplies, the juice box incident this afternoon, her claims that I was spoiling the dinner party, and her shutting me in just as my blood sugar was dropping. Detective Sullivan listened without interrupting, her face bland but her eyes keen. When I finished, she asked specific questions regarding the time and words Olivia had used. She inquired whether there were any witnesses to Olivia's threats or any proof, such as messages or recordings. I pulled up my previous text interaction with Dad, which revealed my unresponsive calls for aid, gave her my CGM app data indicating the blood sugar decrease and critical alarms, and suggested that the caterers could have observed the juice box incident this afternoon. Detective Sullivan acknowledged and stated that she would be interrogating everyone in the home, and that this was now a criminal investigation into child endangerment and attempted murder, considering that Olivia had purposefully shut me in during a medical crisis. The phrase, attempted murder, made my chest constrict. The truth of how near I had come to death became extremely real. Emma observed my concern and advised they let me relax before asking further questions. But I shook my head and replied, "I want to finish. I wanted to make sure they realized Olivia had done this on purpose, and that it was not a mistake or misunderstanding." Dad entered the room after Detective Sullivan concluded her initial questioning, his face dark and his eyes crimson, as if he had been sobbing. He knelt by the bed and took my hand, saying he was sorry he had no clue what was going on, that Olivia had assured him I was fine and just needed some space. His voice trembled as he questioned why I hadn't come down if I was experiencing a medical emergency, and I had to explain that I'd been locked in, that I'd attempted to phone and text, and that I'd done all I could to obtain help. The revelation that his partner had intentionally harmed his kid while he was 20 feet away, entertaining guests, appeared to crack something in him. He wailed on the bed next to me, and I found myself soothing him despite the fact that I had almost died. Emma and Rick exchanged glances but did not intervene, allowing the scene to play out as they prepared to transfer me to the hospital for observation. Detective Sullivan entered the corridor to speak with Officer Daniel Grant, and I could hear her giving directions about securing the area and separating witnesses for questioning. The dinner party was supposedly disturbed when the paramedics forced their way in, and the Maxwells and catering staff departed. Everyone made statements to the police about what they had seen and heard. Olivia was in the corridor being questioned by another cop when they brought me out on the stretcher. She still looked wonderful, her dinner dress unwrinkled and her makeup impeccable, but her face was frigid wrath hidden under a mask of worry. She tried to approach me, stating she had been anxious and was relieved that I was fine. But Detective Sullivan physically stopped her and told her to remain back. Olivia's mask dropped barely for a second. Her eyes flashed with something unpleasant before the worried girlfriend performance continued. She explained to my father that she was simply trying to give me room to calm down, that she had no idea my blood sugar was plummeting, and that this was a horrible mistake. Dad was following the stretcher, then he turned to face her. "Really look at her." And I saw a change in his expression. He confronted her about taking the key when she left my room, removing my glucose supplies from the kitchen, and throwing away my juice box despite my request. Olivia's countenance shifted between many emotions before resting on protective rage. And she said that she had been attempting to teach me responsibility and independence, that I had been manipulating him with my diabetes, and that she was assisting him in setting limits. The words hung in the hallway like poison, disclosing all she'd been doing for months. And Dad's visage changed from anguish to wrath so quickly that I scarcely noticed the difference. He instructed her to leave his residence and that she had only 1 hour to gather her belongings before he phoned the police. The ambulance travel to UCLA Medical Center lasted 20 minutes. Emma stayed with me in the rear while Dad followed in his car. She kept monitoring my blood sugar and spoke to me, making sure I was attentive and responsive, asking about my usual management routine and how long I had been type 1. When I told my background, she remarked I'd been doing very well given the circumstances, as many kids my age battled with compliance. But the A1C figures I provided demonstrated good control. Olivia implied that I was careless and theatrical about my health for months, so the affirmation seemed essential. Emma inquired carefully about past instances in which Olivia had interfered with my diabetic treatment. And I realized there were countless of little situations that I had downplayed or explained away. She used to insist that I couldn't test my blood sugar at the dinner table because it was unhygienic, causing me to go to the restroom and miss the timing I required for insulin dosage. She had questioned if I actually required snacks between meals, or if I was simply attempting to consume junk food. She even mentioned to Dad that I could be faking my problems to garner attention. That teens were notorious for drama, and I'd probably be alright if everyone disregarded my concerns. Each recollection seemed different today, not as misunderstandings, but as deliberate attempts to damage my health management and connection with my father. Emma listened without judgment and stated that she was writing everything for the police report and that this trend would be valuable evidence. I was admitted to the hospital's pediatric ward for observation, which is typical procedure for severe hypoglycemia episodes. My blood sugar level had steadied at 98, which was comfortably normal. However, Dr. Charles Morgan, the attending endocrinologist who had been brought in, wanted to watch me overnight to verify that there were no issues. Dr. Morgan was in his 50s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. According to the qualifications on the wall, he has been practicing pediatric endocrinology for the past 26 years. He went over my medical history with Dad and me, asking specific questions about my management regimen and what had led to tonight's crisis. When I described that Olivia had restricted my access to glucose and locked me in my room, his countenance turned deliberately blank, as it does when doctors hear information that triggers obligatory reporting requirements. He excused himself and returned 10 minutes later with a lady he introduced as Natalie Miller, a social worker with Child Protective Services who specializes in medical neglect cases. Natalie was perhaps 40, with kind brown eyes and a no-nonsense approach that made me feel instantly safer. She brought up a chair next my bed and said she needed to hear my tale, that what occurred tonight was major medical negligence, and probably willful endangerment. I repeated the tale again, this time with Dad sitting next to me, hearing all the information I hadn't told him about Olivia's actions in the previous months. I studied his expression as I narrated each episode, seeing him make connections he'd missed while it was occurring, and seeing how deliberately she'd isolated me and undermined my health management. Natalie made thorough notes and asked clarifying questions, including whether Olivia had ever denied me access to medical treatment or diabetic supplies. Natalie nodded, as if she had heard similar patterns previously, when I recalled her relocating my emergency glucose to difficult-to-reach spots and her statements that I was exaggerating my symptoms. She stated that people who care for children with medical issues have a legal duty to offer access to required therapies, and intentionally withholding such access might be considered abuse under California law. She stated that CPS would launch an investigation, that Detective Sullivan was already working with her office, and that they would determine if Dad's home was safe for me considering what had occurred. Dad's face turned white as he wondered whether they were going to take me away. Natalie's expression softened, and she explained that that wasn't the purpose. The inquiry was about identifying what protections needed to be in place, but Olivia could no longer have access to me or be present in the house where I resided. Detective Sullivan came about 10 p.m. with updates on the inquiry. She'd interviewed the catering crew, and 2 of them had observed the juice box incident, which confirmed my claim that Olivia had withdrawn critical medical supplies from me despite my explanation that I needed them. She'd also interviewed the Maxwells, who had an intriguing take on the dinner gathering. Apparently, as the paramedics barged in, Olivia tried to stop them from going upstairs, claiming that I was okay and being theatrical. One of the paramedics heard my CGM warning from the 2nd level, and proceeded past her nevertheless. And the Maxwells had witnessed Olivia's facade fall entirely, her worry transformed into rage at having her evening disturbed. Mrs. Maxwell had expressly informed Detective Sullivan that Olivia's behavior had struck her as inappropriate, that she appeared more worried about the dinner party than a medical issue, and that she had attempted to persuade the paramedics to leave before checking on me. The testimony was devastating. Outside witnesses having no motivation to mislead described Olivia's priorities. Detective Sullivan stated she also received the 911 tape from my phone call, in which, while being fairly incoherent, I managed to say locked in and dying before losing consciousness, indicating that I was aware of the planned imprisonment. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and my statement was sufficient to warrant criminal charges, and the DA's office was looking into potential charges of child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. Dad stayed with me in the hospital room that night, sitting on the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, despite my instructions to go home and sleep. He appeared to have aged years in a matter of hours, as the truth of what had almost transpired reached him in waves. When I awoke at midnight, I found him looking at his phone, tears streaming down his cheeks. He'd been going over text exchanges between him and Olivia over the previous 7 months, seeing things differently now and spotting manipulation he'd missed in the moment. He gave me some of them. Communications in which she discreetly undercut me, told him I was being tough with my diabetes care, said that I was envious of their relationship, and used medical circumstances to obtain attention. Dad said he trusted her because she appeared so intelligent and confident, and he wanted to think that someone loved him enough to handle the complexities of our lives. He disregarded his feelings that something was wrong because he'd been lonely, and Olivia appeared like the cure to that loneliness. He apologized again, more precisely this time, admitting that he had failed to protect me, that he had chosen his girlfriend's version of events above his daughter's truth, and that he had allowed someone dangerous into our house. I explained. It wasn't his fault Olivia had been manipulative, but he shook his head and claimed it was his responsibility for not paying attention, for being so preoccupied with his career and his relationship that he missed indicators that should have been evident. Dr. Charles Morgan discharged me the next afternoon with orders to see my usual endocrinologist, and to have unfettered access to diabetic supplies at all times. He documented the incident in full, and stated that the medical records will be made accessible to police enforcement and CPS for their investigations. He also provided Dad with a list of warning indicators of medical neglect and abuse, underlining the importance of watchful monitoring of chronic diseases and the dire consequences of any interference with such management. Dad informed me on the vehicle ride home that Olivia had left the house with 2 bags the day before, that he had the locks changed that morning, and that he had filed a restraining order with Detective Sullivan's aid. Olivia was not allowed to come within 90 yards of me or our house, was not permitted to contact any of us, and would risk instant arrest if she broke those rules. He'd also called Rachel Anderson, a family law attorney who specialized in custody and protection issues, who told him to document everything and thoroughly cooperate with CPS to show that he was serious about the problem and guaranteeing my safety. The restraining order hearing was planned for next week, and Rachel predicted Olivia would fight it, saying it was all a misunderstanding and that I had been having a medical episode that she didn't comprehend. When we returned home, the house seemed empty, but also safer, because Olivia's presence had been removed. Dad had taken all of her stuff, including her expensive furniture and the portraits she had posted on the walls, creating areas that appeared bare but felt cleaner. He'd also returned my diabetic supplies to their rightful placements, placing emergency glucose on the kitchen counter and in different rooms to ensure I was never more than a few steps away from assistance if I needed it. He had printed out my CGM sharing rights and loaded the program on his phone, allowing him to remotely monitor my blood sugar levels. Olivia had convinced him that this was invasive helicopter parenting, but it was really typical procedure for type 1 management. He was overcompensating. I could tell by hovering and asking if I needed anything every few minutes, but I allowed him because we both needed the confidence that comes with attentiveness. Sophia arrived that evening with flowers and chocolate-covered pretzels, my favorite comfort food that I could have if I used insulin appropriately. She'd been monitoring my infrequent text updates and had become concerned when I went silent during the hypoglycemia episode. She stated she nearly phoned the cops herself, but assumed I was simply asleep. She now felt bad for not acting on her intuition, and I had to tell her the same thing I had told Dad. Olivia's manipulation was so successful that no one realized what was going on until it was nearly too late. The criminal case progressed faster than I expected. Within 4 days, Olivia Bennett was charged with child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. The assault accusation was premised on her aggressively shoving me into my room and physically removing medical supplies that I required, both of which constituted detrimental contact under California law. Detective Sullivan phoned to explain that the district attorney treated these matters seriously, especially when there was clear evidence and witness testimony, and that Olivia had been detained that morning at her temporary residence. Bail was set at $50,000, which her family quickly paid. However, the conditions of her release included a restraining order and GPS tracking to ensure she kept away from us. Detective Sullivan stated that the evidence was solid, with the 911 audio, witness accounts, medical documents, and my testimony, leaving little opportunity for Olivia to claim ignorance or accident. The DA advocated for a trial rather than a plea bargain, wishing to make an example of someone who intentionally harmed a kid with a medical problem. The trial was planned for 4 months out, which is usual for criminal trials, and Detective Sullivan informed me that I would have to testify. The concept horrified me, but it also felt important, like if I needed to get up in court and publicly explain what Olivia had done. CPS concluded their inquiry 2 weeks later, with a finding of proven medical neglect on Olivia but no charges against Dad. Natalie Miller visited with us to explain that the inquiry had revealed that Dad had been an unsuspecting victim of Olivia's deception, that he had no awareness of her meddling with my diabetes treatment, and that he had taken swift corrective action once he realized the circumstances. She stated that the home was now deemed safe for me, but she recommended family counseling to help us understand what had happened and restore trust. She also advised that I visit with a therapist separately to go through the trauma of the situation, particularly the horror of being shut in during a medical crisis. Dad agreed to everything, and had previously booked meetings with Dr. Robert Hayes, a family therapist who specializes in trauma healing. Dr. Hayes was in his 60s and had a soothing personality. And in our first session, he helped us begin to untangle the guilt, rage, and fear that had gotten intertwined. He worked with Dad to understand how he had been deceived, and to regain his trust in his parenting abilities. He helped me comprehend the betrayal of someone who should have protected me instead of attempting to murder me, as well as separate that experience from my future capacity to trust people. The restraining order hearing took place 4 weeks after the event, and it was my first time seeing Olivia since that night. She appeared different in court, less polished and more desperate, her costly clothing rumpled and her makeup insufficient to conceal the tension. Her counsel claimed that the restraining order was disproportionate, that Olivia had made a mistake of judgment but did not want to cause damage, and that she was eager to repent and make apologies. Rachel Anderson, Dad's attorney, delivered the evidence systematically. The medical records showed how near I had come to death. The witness accounts outlining Olivia's behavior, as well as the timeline demonstrating her premeditated acts despite the fact that I was in crisis. She played segments of the 911 tape in which my garbled voice begged for assistance. And I studied Olivia's face as she heard it. There was no regret, only calculation about how this would damage her case. The judge, Honorable Catherine O'Connor, who had been on the court for 15 years, listened to everything before issuing her verdict. She determined that Olivia represented a genuine threat to my safety, that her conduct were intentional and knowing, and that the restraining order would be in effect for 5 years, with the possibility of an extension depending on the outcome of the criminal trial. Judge O'Connor also expressed worry about Olivia's apparent lack of contrition in court, stating that she appeared to be more concerned with minimizing her acts than with addressing the hurt she had caused. Olivia's face hardened as the mask finally dropped entirely, and for a brief moment, I saw the person who had locked me in my room and walked away. The trial began in late October, 4 months after the tragedy, and received substantial media coverage. Local press had picked up on the issue, casting it as a cautionary tale about adults who refused to take children's medical illnesses seriously, and the courts was filled with journalists and diabetic children's rights campaigners. The prosecution, led by Deputy DA Jennifer Hayes, who had been litigating criminal cases for 19 years, presented a meticulous case that began with Olivia's connection with Dad, and ended the night she locked me in my room. Jennifer summoned witnesses in a deliberate sequence. First, the catering workers witnessed the juice box event. Then came the paramedics, who discovered me unconscious. Then Dr. Charles Morgan addressed the medical implications of hypoglycemia. Then Detective Sullivan went over the evidence and investigation. Each witness provided more damaging testimony, establishing a picture of willful harm that could not be explained away as an accident or ignorance. When it came my turn to testify, Jennifer carefully guided me through the events, asking precise questions that allowed me to relate the narrative in my own words, while ensuring that the legal aspects were addressed. I talked about my diabetes control, Olivia's months of meddling, the precise threat she made that afternoon, and hearing the key turn in the lock while my blood sugar was dropping. I detailed the dread of being confined, knowing I was dying but powerless to seek help, and hearing the dinner party continue while I passed out on my bedroom floor. Olivia's defense attorney Mark Donovan, who specialized in criminal defense, attempted to raise reasonable doubt by claiming that I had locked myself in by accident, that Olivia was unaware of the severity of my condition, and that she had been acting on advice from pharmaceutical colleagues who had told her teenagers that exaggerated symptoms were common. His cross-examination was forceful, hinting that I was a difficult adolescent who despised Olivia's presence and set up scenarios to turn Dad against her. He asked if I'd ever lied about my blood sugar levels, missed insulin shots on purpose, or manipulated my diabetes to gain attention or avoid obligations. Rachel had prepped me for this technique, stating that defense counsel would attempt to undermine my credibility. And I responded to each inquiry calmly and honestly, admitting that I had made mistakes in management but emphasizing that none of it warranted being trapped in a room during a medical emergency. The jury was paying close attention to these conversations, and I could see several of them staring at Olivia in disdain, especially when Mark Donovan implied that I had planned the entire affair to frame an innocent lady. The notion was so ludicrous and harsh, that even Mark seemed to recognize he'd lost the jury with that strategy. The prosecution's closing arguments were devastating. Jennifer Hayes guided the jury through every piece of evidence, witness comment, and documented instance of Olivia's intentional interference with my medical treatment. She pointed out that Olivia had worked in pharmaceuticals, that she was aware of hypoglycemia and its potential repercussions, and that her claims of ignorance were utterly contradicted by her professional experience. She played the 911 tape again, my voice barely audible as I screamed for assistance while confined in my room. She then urged the jurors to envision their own children confined and dying while an adult who could assist walked away. She reminded them that I was 17 years old, had a controllable medical condition, and should have been secure in my own house. But instead I almost died because someone thought that a business dinner was more important than a child's life. The jury debated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. Olivia's face was expressionless as the judgments were announced, but her fists were clutching the defense table tightly enough that her knuckles were white. Judge O'Connor set the sentencing date for 4 weeks out, and Olivia was remanded to jail awaiting that hearing. The judge noted that she had showed no remorse, and presented a flight risk due to the probable jail sentence she faced. The weather on sentencing day was chilly and wet, which was suitable for the occasion. The courtroom was packed again, this time with victim advocates and medical professionals who had written testimonies emphasizing the need of treating children's medical concerns seriously. During the sentencing phase, Judge O'Connor heard testimony from a number of witnesses, including Dr. Harris, my regular endocrinologist, who testified that my diabetes control had been good before to Olivia's intervention and that her actions had put me at danger of irreversible consequences. She heard from Dr. Morgan, who gave expert testimony that my blood sugar level of 30 was an instant life-threatening crisis, and that further 10 minutes without assistance may have resulted in severe brain damage or death. She heard from Natalie Miller. He stated that medical neglect instances were especially dangerous since fragile youngsters relied on adults for survival. And she heard from me a victim impact statement that I had written and updated dozens of times in an attempt to reflect the long-term impact of being deceived by someone who was supposed to protect me. I mentioned that I still had dreams about being confined in that room, and that I was concerned about my blood sugar lowering since I had connected hypoglycemia with being trapped and helpless. I said that Olivia had taken something from me that I would never get back. The expectation that the grown-ups in my life would prioritize my safety over their own convenience. Judge O'Connor sentenced Olivia to 9 years in state prison, the maximum allowable by California sentencing guidelines for the combined crimes. She noted that the sentence reflected Olivia's premeditated acts, misuse of a position of trust, lack of contrition, and the significant harm she had caused. She pointed out that Olivia had put her social image ahead of a child's life, that she had been methodically undermining medical treatment for months, and that her actions on the night of the dinner party were premeditated and intentional. She stated that persons responsible for children had basic responsibility to safeguard them, and that breaking those commitments in such a heinous manner deserved harsh repercussions. Olivia would be eligible for parole after serving 85% of her sentence, or around 7 years. However, Judge O'Connor advised that the parole board examine her lack of contrition when determining her release. Olivia looked at me with venom as she was brought out of the courthouse in handcuffs. There is no pretension remaining. She had lost everything. She blamed me for her freedom, reputation, and future rather than taking responsibility for her own acts. I caught her gaze and felt nothing. There was no fear or fury, only the cool knowledge that justice had been delivered and that she would never touch me again. When Dad and I left the courthouse, there was a mob of media waiting for remarks, but Rachel Anderson handled them while we slipped out a side entrance. Throughout the trial, the media focused on my case, making it a focal point for conversations about medical negligence and the special vulnerability of children with chronic illnesses. Diabetes advocacy groups used the case to advocate for improved type 1 diabetes education and greater protections for children in need of medical care. I'd received hundreds of mails from other type 1 diabetics who had seen similar dismissals of their symptoms or interference with their care. People who claimed seeing someone held accountable gave them hope that their experiences would be treated seriously. The attention was taxing, but it also served as validation that what had occurred to me had significance beyond my own experience. Several medical organizations modified their rules for spotting and reporting medical negligence in the weeks following sentence, incorporating instances such as adults denying access to glucose or insulin. Schools amended their diabetes care rules to ensure that kids had unfettered access to supplies and could not be denied treatment for hypoglycemia. The adjustments felt like something positive springing from pain, as if Olivia's brutality had unintentionally raised awareness that may help other children. 7 months after the trial, Dad and I had found a new normal. We had completed rigorous family therapy with Dr. Hayes, working through the shame, shattered trust and terror that had almost destroyed our relationship. Dad had learnt to be more diligent about my medical care without becoming pushy. And I'd learnt to express my wants more plainly without fear of causing complications. We had set new habits and limitations. Things like Dad checking in on my blood sugar without passing judgment, and me being honest about when I was suffering rather than attempting to conceal it to avoid being difficult. The home had been redecorated. Olivia's apartments were all filled with furnishings and images that mirrored our real existence together, not some ideal performance. Dad had stepped back from his company development aspirations, realizing that being present for me was more essential than securing larger contracts. Ironically, the Maxwells had contacted Dad after the trial to show their support, and they ended up offering him an even bigger deal than the initial dinner party had hoped to achieve. Mrs. Maxwell stated that they valued integrity over social performance, and Dad's instant protective response after realizing the issue impressed them more than any meticulously produced meal could ever have. I'd begun a blog on diabetes treatment from a teen's viewpoint, where I shared both practical advice and tales about dealing with medical issues as I grew older. The blog had amassed an unexpected audience, connecting me with other young people struggling with chronic diseases and providing a community of support I had not realized I needed. Writing about my experience was therapeutic, transforming pain into activism, and the response from readers demonstrated that telling the truth about terrible events may make others feel less isolated. Sophia had grown even more active in my diabetes treatment, learning about hypoglycemia symptoms and how to administer glucagon, and had developed into the type of emergency backup I required when Dad wasn't around. She'd also been my strongest supporter during the trial and rehab, providing distraction and routine when everything seemed overwhelming. The bond had grown stronger through the crises, and I'd learned that true support required individuals who believed you and acted on that belief, rather than those who expressed worry while prioritizing other things. A year after the event, I testified before the California State Legislature on medical negligence and the need for stronger safeguards for children with chronic illnesses. The testimony was part of a larger drive for legislation that would expressly criminalize interfering with a child's medical treatment, closing gaps that previously allowed adults to claim ignorance or accident. I described my experience in clinical detail, including how systematic interference almost killed me. And I asked politicians to treat these situations as severely as they did physical abuse. The committee head praised me for standing up in public. And numerous politicians particularly highlighted my case when they presented the Medical Care Protection Act, which would improve reporting procedures and raise punishments for adults who intentionally prevent children from receiving critical medical treatment. The measure passed both houses and was signed into law 7 months later. Knowing that my tragedy had contributed to systemic change allowed me to comprehend what had happened. Olivia had tried to silence me and make my demands invisible, but her harshness had magnified my voice in ways she hadn't expected. I'm 19, I'm securely managing my type 1 diabetes, and I'm attending UCLA to study public health with an emphasis on chronic illness management in vulnerable communities. My A1C is constantly in the good range, demonstrating that I have kept the control I always had despite Olivia's attempts to weaken it. Dad and I have reconciled, not the same connection as before, but something deeper, based on tested trust and shown commitment. He never dated seriously after Olivia, instead focused on rebuilding our family and supporting my ambitions. We still talk about that night from time to time, working through layers of trauma and manipulation that continue to emerge years later. The physical scars are mild, with only some small cognitive effects from the extended extreme hypoglycemia that periodically interfere with my memory, but the emotional wounds have taken continuing care to repair. Therapy is ongoing and will most likely continue indefinitely, assisting me in separating what occurred from who I am and ensuring that Olivia's actions do not define my relationship with trust or vulnerability. The locked door still emerges in dreams, although less frequently. And when it happens, I wake up knowing I'm secure, that the door is open, that supplies are nearby, and that people I care about are listening for me. Olivia remains in jail and will be eligible for release next year. I've previously written a statement to the parole board explaining why I feel she is still a threat, highlighting her utter lack of remorse and the deliberate nature of her conduct. Detective Sullivan informed me that jail records reveal she's never accepted responsibility, never admitted guilt, and claims she was the victim of a juvenile deception ploy. That continual rejection strengthens the argument for rejecting parole by demonstrating that she is not rehabilitated or learnt from her misdeeds. I'm ready to testify at her parole hearing if required, to stand up once more and say that putting a diabetic girl in a room as she died served 9 years, but deserved every minute of it. The state agrees with me. Dad agrees with me. Most essential, I agree with myself. She almost murdered me for a dinner party, for her image, and for her need to rule. Some deeds warrant repercussions rather than forgiveness. And I've come to terms with the fact that I'll be the one to make sure she faces the full penalties. Sophia occasionally wonders whether I'm angry since I'll never get those months back. Fear, deception, and a near-death experience changed the course of my life. The solution is difficult. I'm angry about what occurred. About the treachery, brutality, and system that nearly allowed someone to kill me in my own house. But I am also appreciative in unusual ways. I'm grateful that I survived. That my voice mattered. That the experience educated me about strengths I didn't realize I possessed. I learned that I could confront someone in court and state the truth. That I was capable of turning trauma into advocacy. Surviving a crisis sometimes meant helping others survive theirs. Will I choose to go through that again? Never. But because I went through it, I'm choosing to make it mean more than merely surviving. Olivia believed she was silencing an issue when she shut the door and went away that night. Instead, she established a voice that people could hear. In the end, that voice sealed her away. Thank you for staying till the end. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one.